Hast du? Ja. Dann läuft ein bisschen auf. Wind aufpassen, dass das nicht runterweht wieder. So, ich hüpfe rein. Gibst du mir erst die Schiene?
These pictures are deceptive. It's not caves we're going to look at here, it's birds. Even if we have moved deep under the earth with our film camera and lamps. An unusual recording situation, but only in this way can we get a glimpse into the subterranean nesting chamber of kingfishers. It's down here, hidden from inquisitive eyes, that they will set about raising their young.
Ja, okay.
Expedition Kingfisher. Bird studies in Africa.
It's not just in Europe, but also here in Africa, that kingfishers like building their nests and nesting caves in the steep banks of rivers. So, if you want to find out about their family life in one of these deep nesting chambers, you have to go down to them. That's why we've dug a cave here, 2 meters deep and 2 meters long. According to our calculations, the nest of the malachites, the dwarf kingfishers we spotted from the river, should now be directly in front of me. From now on, we have to be particularly cautious and remove the soil centimetre by centimetre, just as archaeologists do. And it's a tense and exciting moment when we reach the back wall of the nesting tube, and for the first time see the white, very fragile-looking eggs of our malachites. It took all of 5 days of patient and precise work before we achieved our goal. Still intact, the tiny subterranean nesting chamber now lies open in front of us. Mr. and Mrs. Malachite, each only half the size of a sparrow, are worried. They have territorial disputes to deal with. Only a few centimetres away is a nasty neighbour, trying to scare the life out of the two homemakers. There's quite a quarrel, to and fro, with neither side giving the other any respite. Both parties are determined to get the best location. It took days before they established something akin to a truce, with an invisible line separating the two territories. Territorial disputes of this kind are nothing unusual on the banks of the Okavango, because only here, where the river creates steep mud walls, can such birds build their nesting caves. Our pair of malachites have been able to capture a whole 15 meters of riverbank for themselves, but they have to put up with neighbors to both right and left, at least for the period while they're raising their young. Who is this looking down with such interest on the commotion created by our malachites? A question even an expert might find difficult to answer. When the tiny malachite finally spots the hidden observer, it freezes in fright. But the young bateleur, a common African species of eagle, has been attracted only by the hectic riverside activity. it simply wouldn't consider a tiny malachite as prey. The star among African kingfishers, the giant kingfisher, has built its cave in the same section of riverbank. The giant kingfisher is almost the size of a raven. It weighs 400 grams, 30 times as much as a small malachite. If you want to study the giant kingfisher in its deep earth chamber, you have to dig out a pretty sizable cave. And in these temperatures, around 40 degrees Celsius, that's hard, sweaty work. We feel more like miners than ornithologists.
Okay.
We had to remove a whole truckload of sand from the tunnel. And after all our labours, we'd have loved to cool off in the river, if it hadn't been for the waiting Nile crocodiles. The giant kingfisher already has hungry mouths to feed, while the pied kingfishers are just in the process of ordering their offspring. Not exactly tender, is it, the way the pair of them behave during mating? You mustn't forget, though, that for many types of bird, this kind of fertilization calls for a tricky balancing act. The male has to get the female in the right mood by light movements of his stub feet. The black and white pied kingfishers are the only members of this species who form groups of 3 or 4 when looking after their offspring. In other words, tolerate an extra couple of helpers. For other birds, this would be an unthinkable constellation. Here comes a would-be helper, eager to take on a job, for example, sitting on the eggs. When it sees that the nesting cave is already occupied, it simply flies off again. During the brooding period, the male malachite keeps its female supplied with food. Here, though, the male seems a bit hesitant about giving up its prey. But the female depends on male support during this period, because she bears the main responsibility for the business of brooding. A brief cool-off, and then it's quickly back into the dark earth cave. The fact that this year the cave isn't always dark, but bathed in bright light from time to time, doesn't seem to worry our malachites at all. As if a character from the Arabian Nights, the gleaming blue Okavango dwarf sits in front of our camera, turns round very importantly at its tiny dwelling, and apparently feels quite at home in the glamorous role of a little film star. Incidentally, the ants crawling around here are looking for scraps of food left in the balls of saliva produced by the kingfishers and which serve as bedding for the nest. The female has laid 5 eggs, and these have to be incubated evenly, kept nice and warm by the loose abdominal plumage, because here in the earth cave the climate is very un-African. It's damp and cool, very different from outside. From time to time, the male kingfisher puts in an appearance with food, so that the female doesn't have to go hunting. For a bird as skilled as the malachit, hunting in this abundant region of the Okavango Delta isn't difficult. The shallow lagoons and river branches are just teeming with little fish, a never-ending stream of silvery prey, enough to make the heart of every kingfisher jump for joy. So it's hardly surprising that the biggest African member of this species, the giant kingfisher, is also lurking in wait for prey here. At the first opportunity, it swoops down from its vantage point and darts into the water with a powerful splash. It has spiked its prey with a mighty dash of its bill, and now heads for the bank. The slow-motion camera brings out the movements very clearly. The fish has literally been stabbed to death, but the giant kingfisher can't fly back to the nest carrying the fish like this. It first has to get it between the tips of its bill. Snakes are among the kingfisher's enemies. A few species of snake have even specialized in robbing eggs or young birds from their nests. For snakes the size of this giant python, though, the entrance to even a giant kingfisher's cave is simply too small. The luxuriant zones of vegetation of the Okavango River forests naturally provide an ideal habitat for many species of snake. Here in this riverbank, hidden 2 meters deep, is where our giant kingfishers have their nesting chamber. The male, identifiable by its rusty red breast plumage, is currently on duty inside the cave. Its job is warming the offspring which have just hatched out. For several days after birth, the nestlings need the constant warmth of their parents' plumage. The bill of a giant kingfisher looks so powerful you'd expect it to frighten off most types of snake. In the African springtime, when kingfishers start conceiving their offspring, large flocks of southern carmine bee-eaters return from their winter quarters in Angola. Without so much as a by your leave, they begin drilling their nesting tubes into the bank of the river. Whether the giant kingfisher likes it or not, he's got company. The steep riverbanks provide a building site for many cave breeders. But here in the Okavango Delta, such sites are in short supply. So the birds often have to crowd together and put up with close neighbors. Something that these carmine bee-eaters, which often congregate in flocks of several hundred pairs, don't seem to mind. Looking somewhat like the fluff of colourful dandelions, the whole flock takes off from the riverbank for an aerial inspection of the terrain. All that commotion in front of our doorstep? What have we done to deserve this? Our kingfisher proclaims its annoyance very loudly. Giant kingfishers are solitary creatures, and you can sense just how upset this one is before it returns to the privacy of its cave with its prey. In the meantime, the baby kingfishers are 10 days old, but, naked and blind, they are still completely dependent on their parents. The fish they're brought are almost as big as the nestlings themselves. It's a bit surprising they don't choke on them. To the human eye, the little ones aren't exactly beauties, but that doesn't seem to worry the parents. When Mr. Giant Kingfisher leaves his cave, he first dives headfirst into the water. This cleaning ritual is never forgotten. It's necessary to wash out sand and excreta which have got caught up in its plumage. Young kingfishers always empty their bowels towards the cave exit to avoid sitting in their own droppings. But this means that the parents always get their plumage dirty when they head for the exit. In the meantime, there have been some important happenings among our film stars in what we called Malakit Bay. Junior number 1 has broken through the shell of its egg, and the parent bird affectionately stuffs it under its warming plumage. For 3 weeks now, the parent birds have shared the task of keeping the eggs constantly at body temperature to ensure that life can develop within them. Now the offspring hatch out one after the other, with a day between each, corresponding to the rhythm in which the eggs were laid. There are 4 of them altogether. The 5th egg doesn't produce any offspring. It was apparently not fertilized. For such tiny creatures, accepting food for the first time isn't so easy. They have to learn to react to the parents tickling their tummies, to encourage them to open their mouths and swallow the fish. After that, father or mother malakit slips their loose abdominal plumage over the young birds, a bit like a teapot cover. We were always amazed at how much these little fellows can puff themselves up by ruffling up their feathers. Not a single nestling is left shivering. They all enjoy the naked, warming skin of the parent bird above them. Daybreak on the Okavango. After a clear but frosty night, the river is enveloped in fog. Only when the spring sun rises will the unusual veil of mist disappear. In the areas of shallow water out of reach of creeping predators, a whole variety of different species of bird have spent the long tropical night. Purple herons, great white herons and little eaglets, cormorants, jacanas, blacksmith plovers, and many more. There are also spoonbills, which seem frozen from tip to toe by the un-African coolness of the night. or at least to one set of toes. Bulky spur-winged geese yawn at the early morning, feeling safe and well in the company of such a vast congregation of birds. The hippopotami have used the night to fill their huge stomachs with all kinds of green stuff. They'll spend the day sleeping in the cool water. The African yellow-billed stork seems to be trying to remember what it dreamed last night. Incidentally, unlike their European relations, African storks aren't associated with delivering human babies. Getting smartened up for the day, that seems to be a habit that catches on with the others. These African black terns follow the example of their larger neighbours. And with so many role models, the giant kingfisher naturally also makes a thorough job of cleaning its plumage. Actually, it's extremely important for kingfishers to keep their plumage intact and waterproof. Not a drop of water must be allowed to reach its sensitive skin when it goes on its underwater hunting expeditions. We've now followed the wide loops of the Okavango to the nest of our malachites. Well hidden behind old military camouflage nets is our film equipment. During the past few weeks, the malachites seem to have got used to it. Our arrival may disturb them a bit, but they appear to sense that these large two-legged creatures don't represent any real danger, and will soon be gone again. Thank goodness they don't notice that one of these creatures, complete with camera and film lamps, remains behind in the steep river bank. The inside of the cave provides the setting for a minor miracle. In front of the inquisitive eye of the camera, the young malachites grow and grow, looked after by their parents. Incidentally, there's nothing, not even a sheet of glass, between them and the harsh light of our lamps. And they've really grown in the meantime, our dwarf kingfishers, although at the moment they don't look in the slightest bit royal. In fact, they look a bit more like small hedgehogs. A few days later, it's already apparent that they're in quite a hurry to grow up. And in exactly 3 weeks, they are almost as colourful as their gleaming blue parents. It's hard to believe that these creatures were only about the size of a human thumbnail when they emerged from the egg. In the deep giant kingfisher cave, we also no longer find helpless, naked chicks in need of protection, but fully grown young birds with a complete plumage. They need 5 weeks, just 2 weeks longer than the little malachites, to resemble their parents. In a few days' time, they'll be leaving the nest, though both parents will continue to look after them for a while. The fish which the older birds now stuff into the wide-open throats of their offspring seem out of all proportion to the size of the nestlings. The fish are always pushed in head first. This stops the fins from sticking in the young birds' throats. The nestlings, no longer so little, know exactly what's coming and wait expectantly. When the parent bird lands in the dark passageway, one of the offspring runs towards it and grabs the large chunk of food. You'd expect this big fish to be more than a mouthful. But just watch. 1, 2, 3, and it's gone. That should be enough food for a few hours, and the now contented young bird leaves the coveted place by the entrance to its sibling to wait for the next consignment. Outside, after every feeding session, there's always the same bathing ritual, and the slow-motion camera enables us to observe it better. In Malachite Bay, the African springtime has already given the first trees a cloak of green. The young malachites are now ready for travel. Any moment now, the first of them will tumble out of the cave. By now, the birds have got so used to the noise of our cameras that we can use the slow-motion camera to record their swift movements even inside the cave. Naturally enough, the malachids have the same kind of bathing habits as the giant kingfishers. Only after they've cleaned their plumage thoroughly do they resume hunting. Inside the cave, it's time for an important countdown. All functions have to be checked and definitely have to be go. You can see how excited these flying pupils are. It's written all over their faces. They fill up with food one final time, and then, willingly or not, the first of the offspring is tugged to the cave exit by its parent and coaxed into following it. This maiden flight lasts just 10 meters and ends in the first thicket of papyrus. Oh dear, not so easy coming to a halt on such a slippery airfield. Nestling number 2 darts out before we can film it, but here this is number 3. We already have an idea what's going to happen. There's going to be a crash landing. But a young malachit mustn't give up. After all, water is an element which they've got to get used to. Drawing on its last reserves of energy, our novice aviator finally reaches a dry spot to recover from the exertions of its first flight. Don't worry, this African monitor isn't going to get our little malachit for pudding. But in fact, quite a number of small birds do fall victim to snakes, monitors or predatory fish, especially in the first few days of life, when they still can't fly properly and can't appreciate the many dangers lurking here. Not even half of our tiny malachits will survive the first year of life. The mother bird holds up a fish to try and lure the tiniest of her offspring outside. At first, it's not at all keen on the idea, but then Malachit Jr. follows the older bird out into the big world outside. For the first time in weeks, the nesting chamber is suddenly quiet and empty. None of the offspring will ever return here. We are very pleased and can breathe a sigh of relief. Malachit number 3, M3 as we called it, has successfully raised its 4 offspring. Here in Africa, that is certainly not something to be taken for granted, as we learnt all too often. Just like M3 with its offspring, we also had a lot of luck here with our film work. For almost 2 months, 54 days to be precise, M3 has been the focus of our anxieties. That's how long it takes with this species of kingfisher from first breaking the sod in the riverbank until the young fly off today. In the first few hours after leaving the nest, the offspring are so excited that they can hardly get a grip on the food their parents bring them. The young birds are distinguished not just by the pale colour of their plumage, but also by the dark colour of their bills. It'll be a year before they're grown up and have the same beautiful red bill as their parents. But within just a few days, the young malachits are independent of the older birds. And they need to be, because from now on they'll have to fend for themselves. But the Okavango River is rich in fish, and this makes it a lot easier for the birds to stand on their own 2 feet. All the same, beginnings are never easy. This attempt failed, and the hungry sibling flies over in vain to try and dispute the catch it expected. In fact, the moment they leave the nursery, the young malachits are very quarrelsome creatures. Each of them tries to show who's the strongest. But watch out. If 2 quarrel, there's always a third who rejoices. Malachit Junior number 3 is about to catch its first fish. Our camera operates at 1,000 frames a second, 40 times the speed of a normal camera. It has to be that fast in order to capture the speed of these birds in flight. In reality, the young malachit only needed a fraction of a second to grab the fish from the water. But the successful hunter doesn't get a chance to swallow its prey in peace. Not as long as its envious siblings are hungry and haven't caught a fish of their own yet. There's quite a dispute among the offspring, and it's difficult to tell who wins. The young pied fishers in this age group certainly seem no less quarrelsome. They also try to drive one another away from attractive vantage points and envy any success their brothers and sisters have. This phase, however, only lasts a few days, during the period when they still have ties with their parents. A fish is plucked out of the water in a flash and swallowed almost as quickly to ensure that no one else can steal it. But not every attempt is successful. Quite the opposite. Over half of these underwater sorties don't produce results, as here. Success for the hunted. Success for the hunter. Diving and hunting underwater are innate abilities, and so too is the ability to process a fish, which often has sharp abdominal and dorsal fins. It often takes some minutes before they have tenderized the food enough to swallow it head first without any danger of choking. Sometimes, when they're in a hurry, they choose the wrong base and knock their prey onto sand instead of onto wood. But that doesn't seem to affect the ability of these pied fishers to survive. The wide spectrum of different species of birds that have become adapted to the river habitat of the Okavango Delta ranges from tiny malachites to mighty predatory birds like the African sea eagles. To utilize the teeming wealth of food in this virgin terrain, evolution has equipped these different species of birds with different methods of catching prey. The African sea eagles have extremely sharp sight and also sharp claws to grab their prey out of the water. Black terns flutter just above the water and pick little insects like beetles from the surface. The red-faced African spoonbills have developed yet another method. They wade swiftly along by the bank and with their broad bills filter all kinds of creatures out of the shallow water. Insects, larvae, tiny crustaceans and mollusks, but also frog spawn. In contrast to the systematic approach of the spoonbills, the method adopted by the sacred ibis seems a bit laborious, poking apparently arbitrarily first in one place and then in another. But it's apparently also successful, otherwise this species wouldn't have survived. The hammerheads are very astute. With their feet, they set tiny creatures moving up to the surface, where they are immediately snapped up. The glossy ibis relies completely on its sense of touch. With its sensitive long bill, it seeks out prey concealed deep in the mud. A similar approach is adopted by the open bill, whose speciality is drilling snails out of their shells with its pincer-like bill. It first sizes up the shell with its bill and then carries it into shallow water to make this tricky task easier. But superior to all the others is the approach adopted by the kingfishers. They swoop down into the water to stab a fish they've spotted from the air.